Welcome to Witch Hunt. I'm Josh Hutchinson.
And I'm Sarah Jack. Today we're talking with Kirsty Brimelow KC, one of Britain's leading human rights barristers and the incoming vice chair of the Bar Council.
Before we begin, it's important to note that today's conversation touches on female genital mutilation, or FGM, as well as witchcraft accusations. Recent research from the University of Birmingham has found that FGM is a leading cause of death in many countries, with an estimated 44,320 girls and young women dying annually due to these procedures.
The fight against FGM offers important lessons for combating witchcraft accusations. Both are harmful practices that persist despite being illegal in many countries. Both often involve cultural and religious justifications, and both require a combination of legal action and community engagement to address effectively.
Kirsty Brimelow has been at the forefront of combating both these issues, playing a key role in developing FGM protection orders in the UK and helping draft the 2021 UN resolution condemning harmful practices related to witchcraft accusations and ritual attacks.
Witch hunts aren't just historical events or problems in remote villages. They're happening right now in major cities like London. And this isn't just a local issue. It's a world problem, which means it belongs to all of us. If we band together, we can stop these harmful practices.
One of the key challenges Kirsty discusses is addressing harmful beliefs while respecting religious freedom. She explains how fear often acts as a trigger, especially when people have deeply held beliefs about the dangers of witchcraft. The challenge becomes, how do we engage with communities to help them place boundaries on their beliefs, recognizing that beliefs don't justify causing harm to others?
The role of religious leaders is particularly complex. Some leaders actively promote witch hunting through harmful practices, while others work to prevent accusations. Finding ways to engage these different groups is crucial for creating lasting change.
Law enforcement faces its own challenges. As Kirsty explains, and as we've seen globally, many communities are too remote to access law enforcement readily. Even when accessible, some law enforcement personnel themselves believe in witchcraft and may be reluctant to intervene. These are just some of the practical obstacles we need to overcome.
Another critical issue is dehumanization. As we learned at our recent conference, in some cultures, people who are different aren't seen as fully human. When accusers believe someone is guilty of witchcraft, they often literally see them as a demon or someone under demonic control, making it easier to justify causing harm.
Like FGM, which has regular progress reports and dedicated experts tracking its elimination, we need similar resources for addressing witchcraft accusations. The UN has set goals to eliminate all of these harmful practices by 2030.
Through our conversation with Kirsty, we'll explore these challenges and potential solutions, seeing how legal systems, community engagement, and international cooperation can work together to protect vulnerable people.
Let's hear what she has to say.
It's a great pleasure to welcome Kirsty Brimelow KC to Witch Hunt Podcast. As one of Britain's leading human rights barristers and the first woman to chair the Criminal Bar Association, Kirsty has been at the forefront of defending human rights both in the UK and internationally. Josh and I were fortunate to hear Kirsty share her remarkable insights in person at the recent Witchcraft and Human Rights Conference in Lancaster. Thank you for joining us today. Please share about your work and expertise.
It's a pleasure to be invited on the podcast. I am a King's Counsel, which means that I'm a barrister at a certain level of appointment. I became a King's Counsel in 2011, and I practice as a barrister in the jurisdiction of England and Wales in criminal law, and also I practice globally in international human rights. And I formerly was the chair of the Bar Human Rights Committee. And it was probably back in around 2008, 2009 that I first started coming across harmful practices through beliefs in witchcraft. And that was specifically through a training project with UNICEF Nigeria. And that then led to further training and looking at the African charters, looking at the African treaties, to the regional and international law framework, and then looking at as well where this belief system came from, and then looking at the importance of protecting cultural beliefs and protecting religious beliefs, but also the importance of the belief not stepping over the line into harm. And from that work, which went on for around 10 years or so, actually training in Nigeria, I'm very fond of Nigeria. So it was back and forth there over a decade or so. From that work, it led to other connections with other organizations and academics who were interested in this witchcraft belief. And they were particularly interested in the ongoing harm that was happening to people through being accused of witchcraft. And that also caused a further link to harm caused to people with albinism. And that was probably the start of different collaborations, which brought everything within the UN to raise attention at the UN, which resulted in a resolution, which I know we're going to come on to talk about, which was passed in 2021.
What do we need to understand about the intersections of your legal specialties? You mentioned you work in criminal law, public law, and international human rights law.
Yeah, the intersections, I suppose, is always quite interesting in that I work in the US. I'd be framed as a trial attorney, in that I'm there defending in serious crimes, so murder, terrorist cases, and also prior to defending, although in the UK we can do both at the same time. But for me, prior to defending, I had a practice as well, prosecuting as well as defending. The intersection between crime and international law and public law really is probably transferring that expertise when I'm in an international setting, in witness handling, in evidence gathering, in comparative law. That's probably where it comes in use. In the public law setting, that is very useful when you are looking at challenging public authority decisions or local authority decisions, and ensuring that people's human rights are upheld when the state is making a decision. So I think all of that all combines when you're looking at, as we are here, you're looking at people who are being abused and their harm is so extreme that they are killed, and killed in a very violent way. And the first consideration is, what is the state doing to protect that person? So this is where it all comes together, because the state ultimately and importantly has a duty to protect life. So there's your starting point. And if it's not doing enough, or if it's not doing anything, then you need to look at what it can actually do and the reasons why it's falling down in certain areas.
Thank you. We often think of it as something far away, but these cases are coming across the desks of lawyers and doctors in cities and towns throughout the world. Could you help our listeners understand what's really happening?
I think that's a really important question, because when we think about FGM, or we think about witchcraft beliefs which lead to murder, we tend to think about them in perhaps a remote village on certain continents, on the African continent, on the Southeast Asian continent. And we don't think about them happening in countries like where I practice, in the UK, and we don't think about them happening in London. But a little bit of history to this, and perhaps to some of my interest in crime, and then what I was in the UK and what I was seeing in Nigeria. Back in 2007, there was a girl called Juliet, and she arrived in the UK from the DRC. Now, she'd lost all contact with her parents when she was 6 years old, and she'd lived with her aunt and uncle in DRC. After an unexpected death, she started being accused of being kindoki, that is, being a witch. And this was the start of torture and abuse towards her that was actually sanctioned by local religious leaders. And it included that she was beaten, she was scalded, she was stabbed, she was cut, she was burned, and chili pepper was rubbed into her wounds. And she was subjected to a forced exorcism, and she was made a domestic slave. The Medical Foundation for Care of Victims of Torture recorded that she recounted to them this. She said they would call me a witch and they would beat me. I had no friends, no life. I was just a dead body walking every day. So this was a young girl in the UK who was rescued from this belief system that was used to harm her. And the methods that we use for the exorcism are the type of methods that we've seen and we do see throughout in criminal cases where this belief system is there. And sadly, the result has been a killing of somebody. Probably a really famous case in London that really hit attention was the torso of a small boy who was washed up from the Thames in London. And he was given the name Adam, but his identity has never been been uncovered. From his DNA, he come from somewhere within Western Nigeria. And it looked like he was the victim of a ritual sacrifice. So this was only in 2001. And the big case here, which resulted in an inquiry, was the case of Victoria Clambier. And she was a young girl who had left a really caring family on the Ivory Coast in 1999 to come to London to live with a relative, a great aunt. And she'd been sent to London by her caring families for a better life, a better education, and in order to get a head start in life. And within a year of her arriving in London, she had been murdered by her great aunt and her great aunt's boyfriend. Now, the preacher at the local church where her great aunt attended had declared her Kindoki, and she died. Victoria Clamby died at the age of 8, and she had 128 separate injuries on her body. She died of hypothermia in hospital. What triggered the inquiry was that she, before her death, was known to 3 separate housing authorities. She was involved in 4 different social service departments, and she'd been known to 2 child protection teams of the Metropolitan Police. And she'd also been admitted to 2 NHS hospitals and then discharged and returned home, despite evidence of abuse being observed by staff within the hospital. This resulted in a report from Lord Lamming in 2003. And the report's a very important one because it looked at the institutional failures, of course, the failures of the state, different branches of the state to protect this little girl. But what it did look at and wasn't really instructed to look at was witchcraft, Kindoki, which was very much at the heart of it. And this has been a problem I found with data collection. And data really is key. So in the UK, where there's a murder and where perhaps the reason for the murder is put forward by the defendant is because of an evil spirit or jinns, I was acting to get rid of that evil spirit. The data is not recording it under any witchcraft belief. It's going to record the offence itself, the murder, and it will record the sentence. And often in cases such as that, there are psychiatrists involved, and the dispute within the court is whether the person is fit to plead, whether they have capacity to plead. And often when it comes to sentence as well, it is whether it's somebody who needs to be detained within a mental health hospital. So the sentencing is focused on. But again, the witchcraft belief and the harm coming from that is not. So we're lacking in a lot of data. And I can give you other examples of children who within the murder trial, it has come out, or within the grievous bodily harm or cruelty of a child, it has come out that the motivation of the adults abusing the child have been that this person is a witch. And quite often there is a local religious leader who is giving affirmation to the belief of the guardians of that child that they need to act in this way to get rid of the evil spirits, and terrible cruelty results. Now, there's absolutely no doubt that even without a resolution, you don't need a UN resolution to set out that this is completely unlawful. This is crimes. You have domestic law, which covers the crimes of really serious harm, of torture, of murder, of manslaughter. There's plenty of domestic crimes, and that's the same in every jurisdiction. But really what we're trying to do is just trying to bring this all together so we can also tackle the cultural aspect, if that is what it is, of witchcraft belief and witchcraft belief going over so in manifest harm. You can hold whatever beliefs you like. And in fact, I've spoken to a whole room full of witches. And in that room, nobody was saying that they can harm people when they practice their witchcraft, if we use that word. So that's the difference, is stepping over into harm. And that's where the law has always had that line. That then is a crime. And so I think what's really important with bringing everyone together and within international law, within the UN, is just really to set out that this is a global issue. It's not in some village somewhere where you might have your sort of unconscious bias, so this is only done within a certain tribe. This is happening in London.
We're finding the same issues with the data in the United States as well, because in the end, in the legal process, as you mentioned, what gets noted down is the crime itself and the result of the trial. And you mentioned targeting the cultural aspects of it. How do we work with cultural aspects with sensitivity to the underlying cultures?
Yes, it's obviously important to be sensitive to other cultures. However, the law is really clear, including regional law, that cultural beliefs don't trump harm to a person. And there's a line, quite simply. And to me, that's not such a difficult line to explain. And it's the right line. So obviously, everybody's religious beliefs, for example, are protected. And it's important that they're protected. And they're protected under international law, so that the state has a duty to protect your beliefs. And you have a right to freedom of thought, to conscience and religion. And that on the global stage is under Article 18 of the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. But any harmful manifestations of that right fall outside the scope of that right. So it's a qualified right. Like many rights are qualified. The right to life is an absolute right. It's really just that, it's that proportionality and that qualification. And particularly when you have a child involved and the child's got their own rights as well. And there's a heightened right with a child for protection from the state because of their vulnerability. And the special rapporteur, the UN Special Rapporteur on freedom of religion or belief has emphasized this. And I think he put it in a very pithy way. And they said this, that the serious harm inflicted on persons accused of witchcraft can never be justified. And that if someone were to invoke the right to freedom of religion or belief in order to support harmful practices such as persecution and punishment of alleged witches, this would be a clear case for limiting the application of freedom of religion or belief. So it's very clear. Here's your cultural expression. Here's your religious expression. Here's the limit, because the harm is taking you. The limit is there where the harm is. And I have personally found, I don't think found particularly difficulty communicating that message when I've worked in Nigeria. However, it's very difficult it's who it's communicated to. And it is very difficult if you live in a community where you don't have much money and you're reliant on perhaps your crop or your animals, and then there's some tragedy within that sphere. And then your local pastor tells you that's because your child is a witch. And that is very difficult for people then, if they have that belief. They will then perhaps absolve themselves of responsibility and consider, well, I'm doing what the pastor has said, or the pastor is doing it for me. And that's where I feel we should be doing much more to bring together religious leaders so that they can discuss this, and to bring together the pastors who do preach that these kind of practices are acceptable practices.
That's a really great example of being able to bridge the gap between that message from the UN resolutions and then the reality of what's happening in communities regarding addressing harmful practices. Is there some background that you could give us on the UN resolution targeting FGM? And then anything else you'd like us to know about your experience with the resolution on harmful practices related to witchcraft accusations?
Yeah, so I think when you're looking at law and you're looking at any UN resolutions and you're dealing with issues which have perhaps arisen through a belief system, the law can be a very blunt instrument. So that's why I think there's a sort of combination of factors which come together in order to bring forward a solution that's actually going to protect people who are vulnerable. And one thing that was an issue in the UK was that although FGM is a crime, there hadn't been any prosecutions for FGM, and there hadn't been a successful conviction for FGM until very recently, in fact. And so I was at the time chair of the Bar Human Rights Committee, and we started looking at perhaps other ways of preventing the crime being committed. And in fact, we got quite a lot of pushback from some of the absolutely brilliant activists in the FGM area, because they were much more focused on wanting punishment, wanting a conviction, wanting a criminal process. But what we did was we looked at whether there could be a preventative measure in the same way there was for forced marriages, for early child marriages. And we thought that you could actually bring in an injunction if there was a concern that a child was going to be taken out of the jurisdiction for FGM to be performed on that child. And so we made these suggestions to our parliament. And I and another member of the Bar Human Rights Committee was then involved in working alongside the legislature on the drafting of what became FGM protection orders. And they've been very successful because it also removes it from the family dynamic of putting somebody in a position where they might have had FGM themselves, and they were in a position where they would be having to report on family in order to protect their child. In that, with the FGM protection orders, a school could make a report to a local authority. In fact, anyone who got some concern, and the level of concern didn't have to be particularly high, to get an injunction to prevent the child being taken out of the jurisdiction. And it was happening, and there was data to show this was happening, particularly during summer holidays. And so much so that it was called a cutting season, when kids were taken back to their place of heritage to be cut. So that's been very successful. And I've often wondered whether might be something similar that could happen with witchcraft, because kids as well, there's evidence of kids disappearing from school. And again, concerns that they are being taken back to certain places where there would be access to an exorcism of the child, as a abuse of the child done in secret. And if there was any concern of that, again, there could be a protection order in place. I think that sort of criminal law only goes so far, and to actually try and protect is one way of progressing the law. With the UN resolution, I mean, the UN gets lots of criticism. What's the point of it? Is it all a big talking shop? My view is that it's very important to have this UN resolution, which was, I was one of the people who drafted it. But what was very important is it was Kenya, in fact, that pushed it forward, and then you get the agreements of the other states. And it really is historic because it does various things. First of all, it brings the issue of witchcraft within the UN framework. So that means it's monitored. That means there has to be reporting on it. And that starts to link to collecting of data. And it actually sets out and urges states to condemn harmful practices related to accusations of witchcraft and ritual attacks that result in human rights violations. And this isn't something being imposed by other jurisdictions coming into a country and can be thought to be imposing their own cultural beliefs. This is something coming from a coming together of all countries, a diverse set of nations, and them agreeing that there has to be a condemnation of accusations of witchcraft. And it also encourages and urges states to take measures necessary to ensure the elimination of harmful practices and anti-human rights violations related to accusations of witchcraft and ritual attacks, and to ensure accountability and effective protection of all persons. And of course, all of this resolution also applies to the belief that people with albinism, their body parts are lucky. And I first came across that belief through a film called White Shadow, which was being sponsored by the Tanzanian embassy at the time, a number of years ago now, in London. And then I met a hugely brave young activist, a woman with albinism. She had been attacked in our home and had had both her arms cut off because of this belief that her body parts could then be used to bring luck. And there's actually a sort of spike in these killings in different areas of different countries, such as Tanzania, where there's mining or where there's fishing, and there's the spikes in attacks on people with albinism in those areas because their body parts are actually used to sprinkle at the mouths of mines. And so the resolution is taking that on completely squarely. And that actually is very important to bring together these harmful beliefs and to look at tackling them together, even though they're driven by opposite ends. One is believing in evil and the other is believing in luck, but they're resulting in harm, serious harm to people. Just to add on the UN resolution, just a bit of information if you're interested in how it developed. We held, and I was the moderator on it. It was the first conference on this issue on witchcraft belief and belief in harm caused to people with albinism through this belief in their body parts bringing luck. In September 2017, this was the first conference at the UN as part of the UN Human Rights Council session. And what was important was it linked partners from across the world globally, and it linked the activists, it linked the people living in the places where they were in fear and suffering and had suffered. And it was just very informative and it couldn't be ignored. And I think since then, there then was, as you probably know, there was then a conference in 2019 at Lancaster University, again, bringing together globally actors in this area, which then moved on to the UN resolution, which was passed on the 5th of July 2021. And that was very much driven by the indefatigable Ike Iro, who had been set up as the independent expert on the rights of people with albinism. She was absolutely fantastic. But that all arose through all the work, the build-up, trying to get bringing the charities, NGOs together to get that position created. So a lot can happen, I think, with a small group of people. And here I am now talking, and we met at the last conference at Lancaster University, where I was able to hear and be informed about the challenges and the witchcraft belief in the US, and so the links go on, and the movement goes stronger, involving people with all sorts of different expertise and different viewpoints.
And with the resolution in place, now's the hard work of implementing it as well. And what lessons can we learn from the implementation of the FGM resolutions?
It's a really good question as to what lessons to learn. It's always important, I think, that people have ownership of a resolution. And the good thing with this is that's been achieved because the fact it is passed, there's an ownership there with the state. So you have government ownership. The ownership of people, if you are affected by it, can probably only be achieved through having meetings, bringing people over. It's brilliant now with the technologies we found at Lancaster. You can link people up and on a screen so that their viewpoints and their practical issues are considered. The data and the data collection is absolutely huge, because if you don't have the data, then there's not going to be recognition of the seriousness of the issue. And the data that we had, which is still the latest data, was in which we had before the UN resolution, was that in 2021, there have been over 20,000 victims across 50 countries and 6 regions who had faced extreme human rights violations, including loss of life, loss of limbs, and property due to harmful practices which were inherent to and emanating from accusations of witchcraft and ritual attacks. And so that data is very solid on the need to protect people. And very recently, the University of Birmingham in the UK has been doing research on harm through FGM globally. And it's found that the FGM and cutting is a leading cause of death in practicing countries. And the study that it undertook estimates that 44,320 girls and young women die annually due to FGM and cutting. And this is critical data, because what it does is it's moving this practice from being harmful to being life-threatening. And so if you start to frame the belief or the cultural practice in a way as it's not only harmful, it's life-threatening, then perhaps people start to reply in a different way. So data is really key, but also I still think that religious leaders remain absolutely pivotal in this. And we're not seeing enough conferences or enough discussions where those pastors who are preaching, and I've seen it a lot in Nigeria, who are preaching harmful practices, and also Nollywood films, where it's within that entertainment industry, we're just not seeing any engagement, partly because I think that the pastors are so powerful. They tend to be very rich, very powerful, and it's difficult to engage. And criticism of them quite often results in a lawsuit. So it would be good to try and get them within the UN structure to actually have an open debate on the harm and the results of their preaching and see what their viewpoint is.
You mentioned their powerfulness and the lawsuits and then the engagement that's really needed. What I'm wondering is, because there's been such extreme crime tied to some of those religious institutions and specific leaders, where do you start with that because of the accountability? Because we're in a place now where some of these people have the data on how much crime has been tied to their campaigns against alleged witches is enormous. What do we do? How do we get into that community, how do we bring those leaders into these conversations with us?
If there's evidence of a crime being committed by whoever it's committed by, if it's committed by a religious leader or if it's committed by somebody making a speech, or there's no immunity attaching to somebody because they're a religious leader. And it probably has really got to the stage where the criminal law enforcement might be the only solution if there's no conversation that's able to take place. And some of it is gathering the evidence. And previously, the evidence of what happened within a religious gathering wasn't as easy to gather because it relied on eyewitnesses, on churchgoers, on people who were to inform on somebody they might be frightened of and they might be in danger from. Now, there's plenty of ways of gathering evidence. Everybody's got a mobile phone to record. So I think probably states really need to grasp the nettle a little bit more. I know some states do ban certain preachers from entering their country because of what they preach. But that really is just keeping the problem over there. And the countries that are banning those preachers, perhaps they can try and open dialogue, maybe state to state is one way of doing it. And religious leaders to religious leader in terms of dialogue is another way of doing it. But failing all of that, there needs to be some way of implementing the criminal law where harm is being caused to children. Because in the UK, you see it all over the world, I've given the terrible statistics, but that we did actually have here as well a report as a result, which did look at criminal law and witchcraft beliefs. And that was by Eleanor Stobart, and I recommend reading that. I mean, again, it's quite a long time ago now, but it was called Child Abuse Linked to Accusations of Possession and Witchcraft. But here it's focused much more on child protection. But it's quite useful. It's quite useful for looking at patterns of criminal behaviour in order to identify if a child perhaps is being perceived to be a witch. And so that is quite useful for social workers and so on to identify. But that arose from a case which I'll just tell you about very briefly, and it really brings to light the harm. And I'm deliberately using cases in this jurisdiction because it is global, and you would not think that it's happening in London, but it absolutely does, and so I think a real strong steps need to be taken. This was a case where the defendant was a number of defendants, Pinto, Kisanga, and Mwanza, and this was back in 2006. Again, a young girl and an 8-year-old, and she was found in East London by a street warden sitting on the steps of a flat, alone, shivering, afraid. And she'd been labelled as a witch by her relatives, aunt, uncle. And again, this was the belief in witchcraft. So starve the child, starve the evil spirit. So there was a starvation, deprived of food. And again, there was the chili peppers rubbed in her eyes. And the defendants were convicted of a number of counts of child cruelty, and their sentences were sentenced to different between 10 and 4 years in prison. There was then an appeal against sentence, but the appeal actually focused on some explanation or some mitigation through their beliefs, is that they genuinely believed the child was a witch. And so it was put before the Court of Appeal that the sentences should be reduced because this was a genuine belief rather than something which was evil coming from them. But that to me is just a completely misguided mitigation. It's not mitigation. And we need to also see the courts really, really slamming down on this because of the harm that is caused. And the Court of Appeal said this in that case. It said, such a belief provides no mitigation, and in our judgment does little to reduce the culpability of the offenders. Their sentences were slightly reduced on other grounds, but the Court of Appeal there really sort of knocked that out. And then we had the report from Eleanor Stobart. But these cases keep coming. In terms of identifying, there's obviously another aspect. And I've worked actually training social workers in the UK, and I've worked alongside the National FGM Centre and Bernardo's, looking at signs that a child is perhaps being abused through a witchcraft belief. And some of the findings from the Stobart report in particular was that the age of these children where the witchcraft belief, where they were being abused, was between about 8 and 14. Although it's a little difficult on that data because at the age of 14, a kid's got agency, so they could run away probably at that age if they or find another way of dealing with what's going on. And also found that schools are the first point of referrals, and that these kids will come to notice through signs of neglect, and that would include neglect with wearing unseasonable clothing, really, really warm clothes to overheat the person in summer, very light clothes so that the child is very, very cold in winter, and other neglect. And it also found that the backgrounds of these children, they included a significant number from the DRC, but also from Southeast Asia, from Nigeria, from the Caribbean, and about half were born in the UK. And in terms of carers, it found that in 6 cases, the children lived with their natural parents. And in 19 cases, there was a step parent or a carer in the household. So that was taking as the predominance there in terms of the care. And a common feature in terms of behavior of the kids, which had triggered their witchcraft belief, was a difficulty of the carer accepting a difference, including a form of disability, an illness, challenging behavior, sleepwalking, bedwetting, and bad dreams. And all of these were leading to an accusation of evil or possession or witchcraft. And the methods to get rid of that evil included beating, burning, starving, isolation, including removal from school. So another sign is the kid is suddenly taken out of school and is disappearing off the radar. Recommendations actually from the Stobart report, which says quite an old report, it's a very old report now, but they included child protection procedures in places of worship. I thought that was this rather long answer to come back around to the places of worship again, where of course people have faith and they have confidence and they have belief, and it can be difficult, but there needs to be more child protection looking at this specific issue.
Yeah, we really have had that discussion. I'm hearing a lot today about what success can look like. So when I think about how massive organizations that have children and they're not necessarily prioritizing their safety, it kind of seems like a no-brainer, but I think we are needing to follow the example of the National FGM Center. They have done such a great job of collecting data and then engaging with safeguarders across the different ways that adults are interacting with children. And I really learned a lot from the conference listening to them discuss that project. So I hope that more can be learned from that work.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's so important that people are linking their different experiences, because it is protecting the most vulnerable in our society. And globally, people do want to protect children. But there's a real issue here that in the UK, coming from a country, I was brought up in Lancashire, in the northwest of England. I was brought up with all the stories about witches and the Pendle witches. And people are surprised. It's still going on. It's still going on, and real serious harm is being caused to people because of a witchcraft belief, which we all thought had left us back in the 1500s, but no, it hasn't.
Thank you so very much. This has been wonderful. It's so informative hearing from you with your direct involvement in these resolutions.
I probably would add, just going back to collaboration, What's been really interesting since the UN resolution has been that there have been movements across the world to try and tackle harm caused by witchcraft stigmatization. And some of those advances are, for example, in August 23, there was a coalition of UK and Nigeria-based NGOs which used the International Day Against Witch Hunts to call for government and key partners to join together to actually implement the UN resolution on the elimination of witchcraft. In July 2023, Ghana's MPs passed a bill criminalizing witchcraft, although it wasn't signed by the president. March 23, the Pan-African Parliament released its guidelines on accusations of witchcraft and ritual attacks towards eliminating harmful practices and other human rights violations. And he did this at joint sittings of the Committee on Gender, Youth, Family and People with Disability, Committee on Health, Labour, Social Affairs, Committee on Education, Culture, Tourism and Human Resources at the PAP headquarters in Midrand in South Africa. So that just shows the collaboration and how this belief in harm goes across so many different social aspects of society and how we live. In 2022, there was an article by a Canadian research team recommending future research should incorporate the terminology of the resolution when gathering data on albinism, particularly where negative myths and stigma on the condition are well documented. In 2022, the South African Law Commission undertook a review of the Witchcraft Suppression Act. And there have been calls to pardon and some success, I believe, that you can talk about, you've been talking about, which I learned about at the conference. And there have been calls to pardon those historically accused of witchcraft in the UK. And that's ongoing. And in Scotland, in fact, there was a near success in getting that through. And then there was a political change. And so no doubt be picked up again. And I'm very interested in the calls to pardon for the Lancashire witches, which, say, was where I was brought up. And there was these terribly unfair trials and terribly awful accusations. And these people were killed, which we look back on now and we see that they were unlawfully killed. And it'll be good to get recognition, perhaps, of what happened to them in the same way as happened in Connecticut. So perhaps those are some steps that bring back to people on a national domestic level what it means. And then if you draw it up to the modern day and make people just look frankly and directly at what's going on now and the harm and the killings, the murders that are happening now, the cruelty that's happening now when this belief is translated into harm. Then hopefully people can draw from the lessons of the past and realize that it's time again to really bring an end to it.
Thank you for joining us for this episode of Witch Hunt.
We will have more for you next week.
Have a great today and a beautiful tomorrow.